Let me focus your attention this morning on Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3. This is week 3 in a 6-week series that I've entitled Pictures of Grace, where we are going back to the Gospels and we're looking at different episodes, accounts in the life and ministry of Jesus to see how his amazing grace wrecks our categories of conditionality. He turns everything that makes sense in our conditional world upside down. And so, as I've said each week, there is nothing more shocking than God's grace. There is nothing more wrecking than God's grace. It is, at one and the same time, the most wrecking and liberating thing in the whole cosmic order. And so we're going back to the Gospels to look at different accounts. It's been really difficult, actually, for me to go back and select various accounts, because as I turn each and every page of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is so much there that I want to preach. There is just so much from Christ's life and ministry that would serve the particular end of wrecking us with his amazing grace. But I've had to be somewhat selective, and this week I want to look at Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Mark chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come here.' And he said to them, 'Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?' But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." And may God give all of us deep, big, bright insight into this rich portion of his word. As I've been making my way through the Gospels and selecting stories to preach from, it's become very, very apparent to me that in almost every case where Jesus has an encounter with someone who is sick on the one hand and needing to be healed, or someone who is self-righteous on the other and needing to be wrecked, whoever Jesus encounters, stubborn disciples, people who can't understand what he's saying or misinterpret what he's saying, what we see in almost every encounter is Jesus wrecking people's categories with his grace. And as I said a few minutes ago, turning everything that makes sense in our conditional world upside down. And by doing so, what he demonstrates is that there is no safe, balanced version of grace. As I mentioned last week, God's grace is radically unconditional, radically uncontrollable, radically unpredictable, radically undomesticated. It unsettles everything. In fact, as I mentioned at the beginning of the sermon last week, if grace doesn't cause you to say, "Wait a minute, that can't be right," then it's not grace. It's that counterintuitive. It's that shocking. It's that scandalous. And we see that here again in this account. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 6 follows a story where, again, the Pharisees are out to get Jesus. At the end of chapter 2, Jesus is walking through some grain fields, and as they made with his disciples, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, it says. And the Pharisees cried, "Foul! It's not allowed on the Sabbath. You can't do that. That's work." They were meticulously concerned with keeping the rules. with abiding by the law as they understood it. And of course, Jesus gives this remarkable example going back to the Old Testament with regard to David. And then in verse 27, he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And then, beginning in chapter 3, it says, "And again he entered the synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus," it says. These Pharisees, these religious leaders were watching him, hoping that he would mess up so that they might have a case against him, so that they might be able to accuse him. And as I made my way last night, literally until about 12:15, I made my way, I thumbed through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, through all four Gospels, and I realized that, I don't know if this is an exact percentage, but it's close. At least 60% of Christ's healings of people who were sick and in need of physical help happened, according to the text, on the Sabbath. In fact, it became very curious to me that the writer, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wanted to point out that these things were taking place on the Sabbath. And that was radically offensive to the Pharisees as they came to understand what Sabbath observance was and what it meant to keep the rules and what it meant to maintain the regulations as they understood it. And so there are two things that I want to look at briefly here. I want to look at the fact that grace threatens our systems. That's point one. And then point two, grace grieves our slavery. We see both of those things very clearly here in these verses. Grace threatens our systems, and all of us have them, and grace grieves our slavery. The religion of the Pharisees was a system based on conditionality, our ability to keep God's laws. It was a very clean, do-it-yourself formula. Do certain things, and certain things are guaranteed to happen. Be strong, do what's right, God will love you, and you'll be okay. That was the basic idea. That was the system, okay? Be strong, do what's right, God will be impressed, everything will be fine. On the other hand, be weak, don't do everything right, God will be upset, and you'll be a wreck. Okay, that was the basic system. It was a to-do list system. It was a list where if you could check all of the right boxes at the right time, in the right way, you would be fine. God would be impressed, you would be happy. Okay, that was the basic system. Now, that sounds a lot like many of our religious systems. Okay? In fact, that sounds very much like the way many people, even inside the church, think when they think about God. And the goal of the Christian life. The goal of the Christian life is to do. Tell me what to do. And therefore, it becomes a to-do list for us to impress God and to gain God's favor, and to not only to impress God, but to become very happy with ourselves and to feel clean and to feel like we are being very productive and all of those things. Well, this was a system that was built to maintain control and independence, because their system, the Pharisees' system, and ours, in most cases, provide the necessary criteria by which to judge others. Okay, this is a system that actually makes us feel very good about ourselves. Because if we can do all of the right things, we feel proud. And it gives us a reason to look down our noses on those who just aren't cutting it, those who aren't getting it. And so this is a system that enables us to maintain control and independence. We can conclude, if we do it right, that we're better than them because we're getting it done and they're not. We're good and they're bad. We like that. The Pharisees loved it. And so to the Pharisees, there was nothing more important than keeping the rules. Keeping the rules, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, was the end game. That was the goal of life. That was it. Our value and our sense of worth depends on how well we observe the regulations. So, along comes Jesus. Everything was going just fine for these guys. Okay, I mean, they had a corner on the market. They were high society. People inside the church, people outside the church were impressed with them. They had political power. They had social status. They were proud of themselves. Everyone looked up to them as holy men because they had built a system. They had mastered the system. And now Jesus comes, and like he did in the temple, he begins turning over the tables of conditionality and wrecking everything that these religious leaders were depending on to make their system work. I mean, he was a nuisance, a big-time nuisance. He was messing it up. And not to mention, he was hanging out with the riffraff of society. And people were flocking to him. And instead of looking up to us, they're now looking up to him, and what he's saying is so different from what we're saying, and now they're beginning to question what we're saying. I mean, they could see their entire kingdom begin crumbling, and they wanted him gone. I mean, they just wanted him gone. I mean, he was ruining everything. Grace was threatening their operating system. That's what was going on. Notice what happens in verse 6 after this account. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians. Now, I don't have time to go into the strained relationship between the Herodians and the Pharisees, but these weren't people that hung out together on the weekends, okay? I mean, these were people who did not partner with one another, but the Pharisees were willing to partner with anybody and compromise all of their standards, whatever they may have been, in order to get rid of this guy who was ruining everything. And so they go and they held counsel with the Herodians. They met together against Jesus, trying to figure out a way to destroy him. How in the world do we get rid of this guy? Now, look at verse 2. This is fascinating to me. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Okay, here they are. First of all, they're in the synagogue, a place of worship. They're not concerned about God. They're certainly not concerned about this man who has a physical need. They were watching Jesus, and notice the motivation. Why were they watching Jesus? They were watching Jesus, hoping, praying, salivating over the fact that he might mess up so that they might be able to accuse him. You know, it's a sad thing when inside the church, and this happens often, I'm guilty of this regularly, there are people in the church universal who we think are somewhat sketchy, and this happened recently with a pastor up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, wrote a very controversial book that I think is bad news, total bad news, and theologically flawed in some remarkably serious ways. And when he came out with this book, everybody, those of us who have been watching him for the last 10 years, have been watching this guy kind of drift a little bit. And so when this book came out and basically he put his cards on the table, there was a sense in my heart and in other people's heart, we got him. And we were thrilled that he finally showed his cards, and we were just happy that he had finally messed up. And now the whole world could see what we had seen happening for years, okay? Now, I'm not endorsing anything that guy says in the book, okay? But I will say this, that it was curious to me that in my heart, I became very proud and self-righteous. I was, like the Pharisees here, watching, hoping, so that I might be able to accuse. Now, there is a case, for instance, against this particular guy, but it wasn't that. It wasn't the objectivity of the case against him so much as the subjectivity of what was taking place in my heart. And it happens inside the church. We want people to fall sometimes, especially the people who are annoying us, people who are nuisances, people who in one sense are wrecking our system. And we want them to fall. We want them gone. Don't make the mistake of reading this account. I'm saying this for me too. Don't make the mistake of reading this account and saying, wow, those Pharisees, what a bunch of jerks. Okay? I mean, as Jerry Bridges says, we are deeply pharisaical by nature, every single one of us. There is a nasty Pharisee that exists in all of us. And so this is not just speaking about the Pharisees back in Jesus' day. This is speaking about me. It's speaking about you. It's speaking about some of our natural tendencies, whether we are conscious of it or not. So they were watching Jesus, hoping he would break the rules so that they could accuse him. They could care less that this man was crippled and had experienced all of the social isolation that accompanied being physically disabled in those days. You know, there was a lot of social isolation that happened for people who were physically disabled. It wasn't just that they had a physical ailment. Their physical ailment caused them to be socially isolated because it was widely assumed that if you were physically disabled, you were being punished for sin. Which reminds me of the story where Jesus is, of course, walking down the road with his disciples, and they come across a man born blind, and the disciples basically champion the reigning idea of the day. Who sinned, Jesus, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus had to correct them. Well, it was widely assumed back in that day that if you were physically disabled, it was because you were being punished for your sin. You were therefore a social and religious outcast. You were a blotch on society. So here these Pharisees were not sympathizing with this poor man's weakness because they would have assumed that he had done something to deserve this. Okay, so they weren't concerned with this man and his need for help. They certainly weren't in the synagogue to worship God. They were inside the church, watching, self-righteously, wanting to accuse. This is what law-based spirituality does. This is the kind of person it turns you into. I mean, you know people like this, where the end game, all of life, is about dotting the I's and crossing the T's and keeping the rules and maintaining the regulations. You know people like that. Some of you grew up in homes where your parents were like that. Some of you have friends who are like that. Some of you have a spouse who is like that. And as a result, judgment reigns over our relationships, and we constantly feel like we never measure up. This is what law-based spirituality does. It makes you accusatory and cold, critical and insensitive to the needs of people. The Pharisees totally misunderstood the role of the law. I mean, Jesus had just explained it to them in chapter 2, verse 27. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What was he saying there? He was saying, you guys are getting it all wrong. You're totally backwards. The law exists to serve the people, not the people for the law. That's what he's saying. People first is what he's saying. They also failed to see that God's law pointed to something beyond itself, to the need for salvation and restoration. So, when Jesus restored this man's hand, he was not breaking God's law, but fulfilling God's law. He was showing exactly what God's law points to. The need for salvation, the need for restoration. After all, Jesus himself said in Matthew 5:17, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so here, I mean, the whole point of the Sabbath was restoration. And here Jesus is restoring this man's hand. And the Pharisees, who were completely misunderstanding the role of God's law and the interpretation of this particular commandment, were charging him with wrongdoing, with breaking the law. And Jesus demonstrates that he's not abolishing the law or ignoring the law, but fulfilling the law. This is the purpose of the law, he shows. This is the bottom line. Grace confronts all of the systems that we build to contain it. All of it. We try very hard. It's unsettling, as I mentioned. It's undomesticated. It's scary because it wrestles control out of our hands. It burns our to-do lists. It wrecks all of our categories of conditionality. We live in a very conditional world. You do this for me, I'll do this for you. You work hard, you get this. You don't work hard, you get that. I mean, everything in our world is profoundly conditional. And so, when grace enters into even our system, the church system, the Christian system, we try to build things to contain it. Don't take it too far, keep it balanced, as I was talking about last week. Grace is the most unbalanced reality in the cosmic order. There is no safe version of it. There's no balanced version of it. And so grace radically confronts all of the systems we build to contain it. Now listen, why, have you ever thought about this? Why are we so attracted to works-based Christianity? Why? Why do preachers who preach messages like this, why do they come under fire sometimes? Because people say, you're not telling us what to do. Please, tell me what to do. Why do our hearts gravitate toward to-do list Christianity? Why? All of us do it. I mean, listen, the one thing we need, and whether you're a Christian or not, you know it intuitively, the one thing we need is righteousness. You may not put it that way, especially if you're not a Christian, but the one thing all of us crave is righteousness, cleansing, good standing, rightness. All of us know down deep that things aren't quite right, that I'm not quite right, that things are contorted and twisted. There's something wrong. All of us know it. And we spend our lives doing everything we can to get things right, to secure righteousness on our own. And so we love to-do list Christianity because, as we sang this morning, we're prone to wander. All of us are prone to wander. Even if you're a Christian, you are prone to wander. All the time, every day, you're prone to leave the God we love and the gospel that has rescued us. We're so happy to announce that we have been saved by God's amazing grace alone. But then we come inside the church, or we begin living the Christian life, and we so quickly resort back to a works-based mentality, a performance-driven version of Christianity. And all of that is an attempt to get ourselves right. It is so irritating, is it not, to simply depend on God? I mean, man, we are seasoned do-it-yourselfers. All of us are. And we govern our lives that way. We are seasoned in this regard. And so, what we find here is that Jesus radically confronts to-do list Christianity. I mean, why are those so appealing? Sitting on my couch yesterday, working on this sermon, thinking about my life, thinking about just the grind that we are in this season of our life. I mean, Kim and I are raising 3 children, 2 teenage boys, Jenna, who's 9, and just as we think about the fact that in 2 years from now, Gabe will be going to college and we're going to have to be making some big decisions soon. I'll have to get a second and a third job to pay for all this. But, I'm just thinking about life, the complexity of life, the difficulty of life, the relational strain. I mean, all of these things. We're all on the front lines here. And I'm thinking, why is it that in the crucible of difficulty, I'm so radically opposed to God's grace alone? Why? Well, it's because I know that I gotta maintain control of things. I mean, I gotta keep the order. Things are gonna spin out of control. I'm in trouble. Listen, I'm not some ivory tower scholar that gets up here on Sunday morning and tells you what I've discovered in books. I mean, I'm living this, okay? As many of you can sympathize if you're raising teenagers. I mean, I'm on the front lines here. Okay, I'm not an empty nester yet, giving wise advice to people who are raising teenagers. Kim and I are living this. So I'm thinking about all of this stuff. And I'm wondering why to-do lists are so appealing. And I realize to-do lists are exactly what our independent hearts crave. We want to do it ourselves so that we can maintain control. And as long as we are provided with a to-do list, we can protect ourselves. Because now I'm in control, and all I have to do is check the boxes. All I need is for someone to tell me what to do, because that brings me comfort. If you simply tell me what to do, and then I do it, gosh, I can protect myself, I can help myself, I can maintain control over my otherwise very uncontrollable world. I am attracted to this because it gives me a sense that I can free myself, rescue myself, save myself. I mean, the law is so comforting because it keeps rescue within our grasp. Let me tell you a little secret. Let me let you in on a little secret. It is not my primary goal as a preacher to tell you what to do. I'm not your mother, okay? I'm not your wife, I'm not your husband. I mean, it is not my primary goal on Sunday morning to tell you what to do. And that's very frustrating for some people, I'm sure, because once a week, we just want someone to tell us what to do. Please. Do you ever ask yourself, why? Why do I crave so badly someone to tell me what to do? What's going on inside my heart? Don't just stop at, you're not telling me what to do. Go deeper than that. Say, why do I want you to tell me what to do? Okay? What's going on inside of my heart that is prompting me, that is pushing me to want a to-do list? I was telling a group of pastors at a conference about 3 weeks ago that if people leave our sermons thinking more about what they need to do than what Christ has already done, the gospel hasn't been preached. It's that simple. Okay? Now, at first, that may seem like I'm not concerned with how you live, when actually I'm deeply concerned with how you live. I don't want some things for you to change. I want everything for you to change, and that's why I refuse to make it my primary goal to tell you what to do. You may say, that doesn't make sense. If you care about me changing everything, then you should be telling me what to do everywhere. No. My responsibility as a preacher is to provide you with new glasses so that you see everything differently. And then what I do on Sunday mornings is I use the Bible to simply polish your lenses. Okay? I mean, it is the job of the preacher to point to Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. That is what gospel preaching is. Gospel preaching is not, here are 5 ways to have a good marriage, 5 timeless principles to be a good parent, and then tacked on at the very end of that, some evangelistic invitation to receive Christ. That's not gospel preaching, okay? Gospel preaching is showing from each and every text in the Bible Jesus and what he's done. Okay, that's what gospel preaching is. And it's actually harder to do that than to simply go back to some passages in the Bible and tell you what you need to do, and then show you, tacked at the end, disconnected from the passage, how you can be saved. Okay, that's not it. discovering what Jesus himself told his disciples on the road to Emmaus, Luke 24, all the scripture points to me. Discovering Christ in every passage and showcasing his finished work before your eyes is what will change you from the inside out. So this is the job of a preacher. It's to give you new glasses. Okay, give you new glasses so that you see everything differently. Not just some things differently, everything differently. And, throughout the week, because of the world, the flesh, and the devil, our glasses get foggy. And so each week we gather together around God's word and we basically use the Bible to polish our lenses so that we can see clearly once again going into the next week. And they get foggy again and scratched and all that stuff. And so we come back the next Sunday. And what do? In song and sermon, we polish the lenses. That's the goal. That's what we are here gathered by God to do. And so this is why I labor as hard as I do to continually get you to focus on Jesus, because the irony is, listen, this is the irony of the Christian life. You have to get this or else you're going to continually resort back to just tell me what to do. Okay? The irony is that nothing gets people doing more than telling them what Christ has already done. Okay? You don't do more by being told what to do. The irony of growth and spirituality is that there is no better way to get people to do more than to be constantly showing what Christ has done. Pointing away from your to-do list to his, it is finished. That's what changes everything. Isn't it interesting? You can either turn there or write this down. But isn't it interesting that in Galatians chapter 5, verse 7, Paul identifies legalism, not free grace, as the enemy of and obstacle to obedience. Isn't that interesting? We often think that grace is opposed to obedience. Okay, that free grace gets in the way of obedience. It's an obstacle to obedience. You say this stuff too much, no one's going to do anything. So stop it. Okay? That's not what Paul says in Galatians chapter 5. Verse 7, it's fascinating to me. I mean, he identifies legalism. Let me just read it real quick so you don't think I'm making this up. I was reading this in my devotions this week. Galatians chapter 5, verse 7. I didn't just read this verse for my devotions, by the way. I'm a lot more godly than that. I think I read like the whole chapter. Good. I'm glad you guys are starting to understand how much I love sarcasm. You were running well, he says in verse 7. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? In other words, Paul says in Galatians, the whole point of Galatians is to show that there is no balanced version of grace, that when you try to add the law to what Christ has done, you are no longer subscribing to Jesus plus nothing equals everything. You're subscribing to Jesus plus something equals everything. And so Paul writes this letter to the churches in the region of Galatia to show that Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And that free grace reigns supreme. That God's amazing grace is just that, amazing. And so he says, you were running well. When you were understanding grace, you were running well. And then these false teachers, these legalists, these Judaizers came to you and started adding a to-do list to the finished work of Christ. Yes, it's Jesus plus all of these things you need to do, supremely circumcision in this case. And he says, that is what has become the obstacle to your obedience. Adding rules to grace, he's saying, adding conditionality to the unconditional nature of grace is actually hurting your obedience, not helping it. One time, I read this last night, one time Abraham Lincoln was plowing behind a mule that had a horsefly on its backside. Okay, and Lincoln's brother came by and flicked it off, and Lincoln said, "What did you do that for? That was the only thing that made him go." Okay? And as I read that last night, I thought, that's the way a lot of us think. I mean, when it comes to the Christian life, the Pharisees and us have concluded that the only thing that will make us obedient is the horsefly of fear and guilt. Keep it hurting. Okay? So that I'll stay in the lines. As I've said before, disobedience happens not when we think too much of grace, but when we think too little of grace. Grace is not the enemy of obedience. Legalism is. Grace alone provides us with the heartfelt impulse to obey. That's it. In fact, the impulsion to do good comes only out of this wild declaration that everything has already been done. And so this idea, and the Pharisees had it wrong, our systems need to be reoriented. Because we conclude that in order for things to be well established, ordered, and right, we need to-do lists. We don't trust Christ's "it is finished." We need to add, the only way you will actually be able to do the things that God tells us to do is if your hearts and your minds are marinating daily in "it is finished." That's it. And so it's not do or not do, it's do, but how do we do? Where does the power come from to do? And the power to do doesn't come from me saying, do this and do that. It comes from saying, "It is finished," every week. It is finished. Okay, that's enough for point one. Point two. Not only does grace threaten our systems, but grace grieves our slavery. Notice here what happens. Jesus gets angry. Okay, this is Jesus, meek and mild, sweet Jesus, and he's angry here. And the anger of Christ here demonstrates that grace is not relativistic. What do I mean by that? Relativism is the idea that everything's basically on equal footing. Everything's the same. There is no good. There is no bad. There is no right. There is no wrong. There is no truth. There is no falsehood. And yet Jesus' anger here demonstrates that grace is not relativistic. That is the way many people interpret grace. It's relativistic. Grace levels the playing field so that there is no longer right and wrong, good and bad, truth and falsehood. It's, that's a misunderstanding of grace. And Christ's anger here demonstrates that it's not relativistic. In other words, grace is not synonymous with anything goes. Jesus expresses anger here at gracelessness. He gets mad at the hardened hearts of these graceless Pharisees. He's angry. Lack of grace should make us angry. And as I thought about that yesterday, I thought, how unbelievably counterintuitive. This is crazy because most of the time it's just the opposite. Too much grace delivered makes us angry. We see people getting away with stuff all the time. And it's oftentimes the case for me that it's not lack of grace that gets me angry, as it did Jesus. It's too much grace that gets me annoyed. That's what annoyed the Pharisees. These are prostitutes. These are tax collectors. You're eating with them. Okay, you're a friend of sinners. They were upset with Jesus because he was giving too much grace. Here we see the difference between grace-fueled anger and self-centered anger or law-induced anger. In grace, when it comes to the economy of grace, anger is fueled by a lack of grace. When it comes to the economy of law, anger is fueled by too much grace. But then notice, Christ's anger is not only stoked by gracelessness, but, and this is super important here, his anger is marked by grief. Now, here's the warning for us, for me. The warning is it can become a very subtle and dangerous thing to drift into self-righteousness when it comes to those who are self-righteous. We become Pharisees about the Pharisees. And so here those of us who know and love and revel in and rest on God's amazing grace can easily become pharisaical when it comes to those who are Pharisees. We look down our nose at them and say, we get it, you don't, we're better than you are. That happens. It happens all the time. We become self-righteous against the self-righteous. Well, Jesus demonstrates a different kind of anger here. It's an anger marked by grief. He was grieved at the legalistic slavery of these Pharisees. Their legalism had made them cold and unfeeling, anxious and judgmental, self-righteous and vengeful. And it was as if Jesus was asking them, why do you continue like this? Don't you see that you were created and designed for so much more than this? You're only shadows of what God originally intended for you to be. God made you to live in freedom, and you're a slave. His anger was marked by grief and tears. His anger was not self-righteous anger against the self-righteous. It was marked by tears. It was marked by grief, because he looked at these men and he saw their slavery and what their slavery had produced. Their slavery had produced cold, unfeeling, insensitive people who were arrogant and anxious and judgmental and self-righteous. They were living in a prison of their own making. And Jesus looked at them angry and grieving, because he was essentially saying, God made you to be free and you've enslaved yourself. And so he gives us a great example here, Jesus does, of how to handle Pharisees. Not in a self-righteous, judgmental, look down your nose, you're Pharisees, you're bad, we're good because we're not Pharisees. That's not what happens here. It's an anger marked by grief. Yes, gracelessness should make us angry. It made Jesus angry. Gracelessness should stoke our anger. It's okay to get angry at the right things. And supremely, what Jesus gets angry at in the Gospels is gracelessness. But that should be an anger marked by grief and tears because of love for those who are enslaved, like these Pharisees were. Their system leads to slavery all around. It leads to slavish pride when we succeed and slavish despair when we fail, and it grieves Jesus. That's the problem with law-based spirituality. It leads to slavery in both directions. If you're strong and mighty and you can do it, you become proud. I can do it. And you become judgmental against those who can't do it. And if you find yourself to be honestly weak and you just can't get her done, you feel ashamed and guilty and terrible and weighed down. And so either way, it leads to slavery. It either leads to the slavery of pride or it leads to the slavery of despair. Only God's grace can come in and wreck our prisons and get rid of the prisons that we erect because of our to-do list version of Christianity. It grieves Jesus, like it does in this story, when we think that the entire Christian experience is about what we do. Even Here's another verse I read in my devotions this week, and it was shocking to me. A friend of mine pointed me to this chapter in the book of John, John chapter 6, the Gospel of John. And when Jesus was asked in John 6:28, okay, the disciples they wanted a to-do list also. They wanted it. They're just like us. And so they asked Jesus, what must we do to be doing the works of God? It's an understandable question. What must we do to be doing the works of God? And Jesus answered, this is his exact answer. This is the work of God. And they're like, what? Tell us, so we can go out and do it. And it's so anticlimactic because he says, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. That's it. And you say, well, what? That's it? I mean, there's got to be more. Jesus, think about it. Meditate on this for a minute, Jesus. Okay, we get that part. Let's fast forward through that. Let's get to the meat and potatoes of to-do lists. Okay, believe in him who said, yeah, okay, right, it's like white noise. Tell us what to do. That's it. Believe in it is finished. Believe in the one who he sent. There has to be more work for us to do than that. The system is not based, God's system, the grace system is not based on what we can do for God, but what he has done for us. No conditions, just grace. And that is terribly annoying. Okay, for us modern Americans who have been told since the moment we were born that our success, our identity, our security, our significance, our meaning, our purpose, our value, our worth is all riding on our shoulders. Get out there and do it. Get out there and do it. Achievement precedes acceptance. You want to be accepted? Go out and achieve. I mean, I know there's probably 100 of you, if not more, right now going, yeah, but, okay, I mean, there are things. I don't know what to tell you, okay? You take it up with Jesus. Don't write me letters, okay? Pray. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to do, okay? I'm at a loss. I mean, I keep saying, when it comes to my children, I keep saying, God, just tell me what to do. Tell me what to do and I'll do it and they'll be good. Please. This grace thing isn't helping me when it comes to parenting children. Okay? I mean, it just wrecks everything. And Jesus just says, listen, relax, rejoice. I got this. It is finished. Okay? Now, just go to bed. Okay? I mean, I love there's a Lutheran theologian by the name of Gerhard Forty, who's dead now, who said, the process of sanctification is a process whereby we daily have to sit there and allow God to tell us, shut up and listen to what I've already done. That's the process. We think about sanctification, the process of Christian growth, as growth beyond our justification. It's never growth beyond our justification. It's growth deeper into the reality of our justification. That's what it is. It's continually going back every single day to it is finished and resting in that. My goal as a preacher is not to make men. My goal as a preacher is to point to the man who alone can make men. I mean, Jesus said, if I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. I mean, that's the goal. So the goal is to be telling you always what Jesus has done. We keep wanting to know what to do, and God keeps insisting on telling us simply what he's done, and that is terribly annoying. But once we get past the annoyance of it, we get to the liberation of it. Let me just conclude with this. A few nights ago, I was reading this story that this woman was telling, where she says that a couple of nights earlier, she had passed through the room where her husband was watching television. And this is what she saw. I stopped and stood mesmerized gripped by the depiction on the screen of a woman drowning. It was so graphic that I had a sense of struggle within me as I saw her fight against the sea that wouldn't let her surface. I remembered the times as a small child my throat and nose burned from the accidental intake of pool or lake water and the sense of panic I felt until an adult hand would reach down and pluck me to safety. For this woman, there was no escape. The seawater filled her lungs. Her eyes bulged with the realization of her impending death. Then she ceased her struggle and sank into the murky abyss. I could think of a lot of ways that I wouldn't want to die. Drowning is right at the top of the list. Nevertheless, I realize that in a spiritual sense, drowning is the very thing I need most. Listen to me. Great picture here. I mean, when you think about someone who is drowning, they are struggling. They are flailing frantically, doing whatever it takes to gain another breath. Doing whatever it takes. There is panic when you begin to realize that you can't save yourself. In panic mode, they do whatever they need to in order to survive. Listen, let me tell you, as hard as this is to grasp, drowning in the ocean of God's unconditional grace is God's goal for you. And if you're anything like me, you struggle and you flail your arms and legs frantically. You do everything you can to save yourself, to get that breath. Everything. And because God loves you, he says, die. Drown. I mean, you're not doing anybody any favors when they are drowning in the sea of God's unconditional grace and you throw them a life preserver so that they can save themselves. I mean, God's goal for you is that, and I know it's tough. It's tough every day for me. I mean, our hearts are law marinated. We just, as I've said, we love to-do lists. We want someone to tell us what to do. And when someone says drown, we say no. And we kick and we scream and we yell and we do everything we can. We say, it can't be that. And we get angry. The Pharisees were angry. It can't be that simple. That's too good to be true. And yet God says, drown. The ocean of my grace will give you life, life abundant. Jesus fulfilled all of God's perfect conditions so that our relationship to God could be perfectly unconditional. That's the good news of the gospel. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus perfectly fulfilled all of God's holy conditions so that our relationship to God could be perfectly unconditional. And my hope and my prayer is that if you're not a Christian, this morning you would drown. If you don't know Jesus and you're fighting inside, drown. And my prayer is if you are a Christian, you would drown. I pray that the ocean of God's grace would sweep through all of our hearts and our minds and drown us so that we might experience the life and the freedom that Jesus paid so dearly to secure for sinners like me.